Disabled woman accidentally scratches a luxury car with her wheelchair. But when the millionaire steps out, the unexpected encounter changes her entire life forever. Before we dive into the story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Stay tuned until the end, things are about to get intense. Now, let's get into it. Leah's arms tightened around Ethan's waist as the motorcycle roared down the empty road, the wind rushing past them like an unspoken dare. She felt alive in these moments, free from the ordinary constraints of life, the burdens that weighed down her days. Ethan always knew how to make the world disappear for her, to take her away from the worries she never spoke out loud. His laugh echoed in the wind, carefree and wild, matching the speed they were racing toward the horizon. "Hold on tight," he called over his shoulder, his voice barely cutting through the engine's growl. Leah smiled, leaning into him, trusting him completely. She hadn't always been this impulsive, but with Ethan, things felt different. She felt different. It happened faster than she could process. A flash of headlights in the distance, a swerve to the side. Her stomach dropped as the world spun. The bike lurched beneath them, a sharp, sickening jerk, and Leah felt herself being thrown into the air as if gravity had suddenly lost its grip on her. Time slowed, and for a split second, she was weightless. Then came the impact, a hard, brutal collision with the pavement. The pain was immediate, sharp, and all-consuming, radiating from her back down to her legs. She wanted to scream, but the air had been knocked out of her lungs. Her world went dark as the sound of the crash echoed into silence. The sterile hum of the hospital slowly pulled Leah out of the darkness. Bright fluorescent lights flickered above her, and the sharp scent of antiseptic filled her nose. It took her a moment to understand where she was. Blinking, her eyes adjusted to the room, a blur of white walls, machines beeping steadily, and the dull ache that seemed to grip her entire body. Her mother's face appeared first, pale and anxious, standing by her bedside. Leah tried to speak, but her throat was too dry, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom?" Her mother's hand trembled as she reached for her daughter. "Leah, sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Don't try to move, okay? Just rest." Confusion clouded Leah's mind. Why couldn't she move? She tried to shift in bed, to lift her legs, but there was nothing, no sensation, no response. Panic started to rise in her chest. What happened?" she asked, her voice cracking. A doctor entered the room, his expression calm but serious. He introduced himself, but Leah couldn't focus on his words. All she could hear was the echo of her own heartbeat in her ears, fast and frantic. "I'm afraid the accident caused significant trauma to your spine," he explained, his words measured, controlled. "You've suffered a spinal cord injury." The words hit her like a physical blow. She stared at him, waiting for him to say something else, waiting for him to tell her it wasn't as bad as it sounded. But his face remained impassive, clinical. "You'll need time to heal, of course," he continued. "But as of now, you won't be able to walk." The world tilted. Leah's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing to grasp the full weight of what he had just said. She could feel her mother's hand gripping hers, but it offered no comfort. All she could feel was the heavy, unyielding truth: her life had just changed forever. Days passed in a blur. Nurses came and went, adjusting her checking her vitals, offering polite smiles that felt more like pity than reassurance. Ethan hadn't come to see her, not once. She overheard whispers from the nurses about how he'd walked away from the accident with barely a scratch. It should have made her feel better, knowing he was okay. But instead, it left a hollow ache in her chest. She stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying the crash over and over in her mind, wondering how things had gone so horribly wrong. Every time she closed her eyes, she could feel the weight of that moment, the instant everything changed. But there was nothing she could do to change it back. Her mother was there every day, always hovering, trying to be strong for her daughter. But Leah could see the cracks forming in her mother's facade. The quiet sobs she thought Leah couldn't hear, the desperate way she clung to hope when the doctors talked about rehabilitation and therapy. But Leah couldn't bring herself to care. The idea of therapy, of trying to regain movement in her legs, felt like a cruel joke. What's the point? Leah muttered one night when her mother tried, yet again, to talk about options for therapy. They already said I won't walk again. Her mother's eyes were red-rimmed, exhaustion evident in the lines of her face. Leah, please, she pleaded. You can't just give up like this. You have to try. Leah turned away, staring out the window. It's not that simple, she said, her voice hollow. She didn't have the energy to argue, to pretend that she cared about fighting this battle. The physical pain was one thing, but the emotional weight of it all was something she couldn't carry. Not anymore. The strain between them grew with each passing day. Her mother's encouragement started to feel like pressure, like an unwanted weight pressing down on her already fragile state. Every time her mother brought up the idea of therapy, Leah shut down more. She wanted to retreat, to disappear into the quiet of her own thoughts, where she didn't have to face the disappointment in her mother's eyes. The days turned into weeks, and Leah found herself slipping further into isolation. She refused to go to physical therapy, canceling the appointments her mother had arranged. Her mother tried to stay hopeful, but Leah could see the weariness in her eyes, the way her shoulders sagged when she left the room. Leah buried herself in her writing, pouring all her frustration and pain into the stories she created. It was the only thing that gave her any sense of control, any sense of normalcy. But even that couldn't erase the emptiness that gnawed at her. The first few weeks of physical therapy were a blur of sterile rooms and machines designed to force her body into motion. Leah had shown up at the appointments because it was expected. Her mother had made the arrangements, practically begging her to try. And so, Leah tried. At first, she wanted to believe it could work, that maybe, just maybe, she could beat the odds. But it didn't take long for the hope to drain away. Every session was an exercise in frustration. The therapists were kind enough, with their gentle smiles and quiet encouragements, but Leah hated them. Hated the way they spoke to her like she was fragile, as if one wrong word would shatter her completely. Hated the way they never acknowledged the truth, that she would never walk again, no matter how hard they pushed or how much she suffered through their exercises. The strain on her body was unbearable. Muscles that had once been strong and lithe from her dance training now rebelled against every movement. Her arms ached from pushing herself around in the wheelchair, her hands blistered from gripping the wheels too tightly. And then there were her legs, useless, heavy things that refused to cooperate, no matter how hard she willed them to move. It was the same routine every time. The therapist would position her legs, try to coax some response, and Leah would stare at her feet as if they belonged to someone else. She felt nothing. No flicker of life, no sign that anything would ever change. After weeks of grueling effort, the faint hope she had started with crumbled. Maybe you're just tired, the therapist would say, offering platitudes that felt like salt on an open wound. Recovery takes time. You have to be patient. But Leah had never been good at patience, and she wasn't about to start now. The more she pushed, the more it became clear, this wasn't going to work. Not for her. One day, she simply didn't show up. She lay in bed that morning, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of her mother moving around the house. She knew there would be questions, that her mother would worry and prod, but Leah didn't care. She couldn't face another session of false hope and empty promises. Her mother's voice came from the doorway, soft and hesitant. Leah? It's time to go. Leah didn't answer. She heard the door creak open, her mother's steps soft on the hardwood floor. Leah, the therapist is waiting. I'm not going, Leah said, her voice flat, emotionless. There was a pause. What do you mean you're not going? You have to keep trying, sweetheart. You can't just. I said I'm not going, Leah repeated, her jaw tightening. She turned her head to meet her mother's gaze, and for the first time in a long time, there was anger there. It's not helping. It's never going to help. So what's the point? Her mother's face crumpled, hurt flashing across her features. Leah, please. You can't just give up like this. I'm not giving up. I'm being realistic, Leah snapped, sitting up in bed. You need to stop pretending like this is something I can fix, because it's not. I'm never going to walk again. The sooner you accept that, the better. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Leah could see the tears welling in her mother's eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to care. It wasn't her job to make her mother feel better. Not anymore. Why won't you even try? Her mother whispered, her voice breaking. Why are you doing this to yourself? Leah turned away, her chest tight with frustration and exhaustion. I am trying, Mom. But you have to understand, sometimes trying isn't enough. The silence that followed was deafening. Leah heard her mother's quiet steps retreating from the room, the door closing softly behind her. And then, she was alone again. Days bled into weeks, and Leah fell into a routine of isolation. She stopped answering her phone, stopped responding to texts from friends who still cared enough to check in. Most of them had already faded away, too uncomfortable with her new reality to stick around. And honestly, Leah was fine with that. The less she had to explain herself, the better. Her world shrank to the size of her small bedroom and the stories she crafted in her mind. Writing had always been a part of her, but now it was all she had left. She poured her energy into her stories, letting the characters and their worlds become her escape. In her writing, she wasn't the broken girl in a wheelchair. She could create people who could run, jump, and dance, things she would never do again. Her mother, however, wouldn't give up as easily. She hovered, always suggesting new therapies, new doctors, new ideas that Leah had no interest in hearing. The tension between them thickened, like a thread pulled too tight, ready to snap. You could try swimming, her mother said one afternoon, her voice strained with forced optimism. The therapist said water therapy might be easier on your muscles. Leah didn't even look up from her laptop. I'm not interested. Her mother sighed, the sound full of weariness. Leah, you can't just hide in your room forever. You're not even giving yourself a chance. I'm fine, Leah muttered, her fingers tapping the keys harder than necessary. No, you're not fine, her mother shot back, her voice rising with frustration. You're shutting everyone out. You're not even trying to. I don't want to try. Leah snapped, slamming her laptop shut and glaring at her mother. Can't you get that through your head? I don't want to spend the rest of my life chasing some fantasy that's never going to happen. This is my life now. Deal with it. Her mother stood there, eyes wide with shock and pain, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words. But there were no right words. Not for this. Without another word, her mother left the room, the door closing a little too loudly behind her. Leah sat there, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands shaking. She didn't mean to lash out. But the pressure, the constant push to get better, to try harder, was suffocating her. It wasn't her mother who had to live in this body. It was Leah. And Leah knew her limits. She opened her laptop again, her fingers hovering over the keys. She let out a breath and began to type, sinking back into her stories, where the world was still under her control. The air was cooler than Leah expected as she wheeled herself out of the house, the late autumn breeze cutting through her sweater. It had been so long since she ventured out beyond her usual path, the small, worn track between her front door and the street, where deliveries dropped off her groceries. Today felt like an outlier, an impulse she couldn't quite explain. Maybe she was tired of looking at the same four walls or had written herself into a corner with her latest story. Maybe, just maybe, she needed to see the world beyond her window, if only for a few minutes. It hadn't taken long for her to regret the decision. She wasn't far from home when she saw him. Ethan, pushing a double stroller with two more children trailing behind him. She froze, her hands gripping the cold metal of her wheelchair tighter than necessary. Ethan. Her heart thudded in her chest, a dizzying rush of old memories flooding back. The sound of his laugh, the warmth of his smile, the way he'd made her feel invincible once upon a time. Before. He hadn't noticed her yet, too absorbed in adjusting the blanket around the squirming infant in the stroller. Leah's eyes swept over the scene. 4 kids. 4. It seemed impossible to her. The Ethan she remembered barely had the patience to sit still for a movie, let alone juggle the chaos of fatherhood. Just as she considered turning back, his head lifted, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them moved, locked in a silent recognition. Leah felt the panic start to rise, hot and fast, tightening in her throat. She didn't want this, didn't want to see him, didn't want to be seen. Leah? Ethan's voice carried across the street, soft and hesitant. He looked different. Older, obviously. His hair was shorter, and the carefree glint in his eyes had been replaced by something heavier, something she couldn't name. She forced a smile, though it felt brittle on her lips. Ethan. Hi. He crossed the street, his kid still following behind, and Leah resisted the urge to wheel herself in the opposite direction. She could feel her pulse pounding in her temples, her mind scrambling for an exit, but there wasn't one. Not anymore. It's been a long time, Ethan said, his gaze sweeping over her, not unkind but curious, almost cautious. She didn't need pity, not from him. Yeah, it has, she managed to say, her voice tight. Her hands fidgeted in her lap, fingers drumming nervously on the armrests. These are my kids, he said with a hesitant smile, gesturing to the little crowd around him. This is Sophie, Luke, Emma, and Jake. Leah nodded, feeling a strange wave of nausea wash over her. She wasn't angry, not really. But seeing Ethan like this, with a family, living a life that seemed so far removed from hers, was like being confronted with everything she'd lost. That's great, she said, forcing the words out. They're beautiful. Ethan smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. I should get them home. It was nice seeing you, Leah. Yeah, Leah replied, though the word felt hollow. You too. The moment he turned and started to walk away, Leah exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her heart was still racing, her hands trembling slightly. What was she thinking, leaving the house today? It had been a mistake, a stupid impulse. She should have stayed inside, hidden from the world where it was safe. Her mind was a jumble of thoughts as she wheeled herself forward, lost in her agitation, her hands moving on autopilot. She barely noticed the sleek black car parked on the curb ahead of her. The next thing she knew, her wheelchair jerked to a stop, slamming into the side of the car with a dull thud. Great, Leah muttered under her breath, looking down at the scuff mark on the car's polished surface. Just what I need. Her heart sank as the door of the car swung open. I'm so sorry, she began to stammer, already imagining the lecture that was about to come her way. I didn't see your car, I was distracted, and I. The words died in her throat as she looked up at the man stepping out of the car. Her breath caught. Jaden. Of all people. Her pulse quickened, not from anxiety this time, but from sheer disbelief. She hadn't seen him in years. Not since high school. And here he was, standing in front of her, looking like a memory she'd somehow forgotten but couldn't quite shake. His hair was shorter than she remembered, and there was a quiet confidence in the way he carried himself now, but his eyes, they were the same. Warm, thoughtful, steady. Leah? His voice was low, a mix of surprise and familiarity. She blinked, momentarily speechless, her hands frozen on the wheels of her chair. What were the odds of this? 2 people from her past, both in the same day, when she hadn't ventured beyond her front yard in months? Jaden? Her voice came out as a whisper, her mind still struggling to catch up with reality. He smiled, that easy, charming smile she remembered. Yeah, it's me. She felt the absurdity of the situation wash over her. This can't be happening, she muttered, shaking her head slightly. Jaden's eyes softened as he knelt down to her level, his hand resting casually on the open car door. I'm sorry about the car, he said, though there was no hint of annoyance in his voice. But I'm more surprised to see you out and about. It's been a long time. Leah could barely find the words. Her head was spinning from the sheer coincidence of it all. I don't leave the house much, she admitted, feeling the weight of the confession even as she spoke it. This was a rare trip. Jaden nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Maybe it's fate, he said with a wink. The universe putting us back in touch. Leah couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. Fate? I don't know about that. He grinned, standing up and offering his hand. Well, whatever it is, I'm glad to see you. Want to catch up? For the first time all day, Leah felt the tension in her chest begin to ease. Maybe this strange day wasn't a total disaster after all. Leah felt her nerves still buzzing after the strange series of events. Running into Ethan had thrown her more than she wanted to admit, but seeing Jaden had almost tipped her over the edge. He had been a part of her life in a different way, a quieter, less complicated way, but still, it was as if the universe had conspired to shake her world today. After the initial shock of bumping into him, quite literally, Jaden had taken control of the situation with the same easygoing charm she remembered. He'd suggested grabbing coffee, and though Leah had hesitated, her curiosity got the better of her. They ended up at a small cafe nearby, tucked in a corner booth that offered a little privacy, and for the first time in ages, Leah didn't feel the need to rush home. Jaden sat across from her, his eyes warm and attentive as they fell into an easy conversation. It wasn't forced or awkward like so many reunions often were. In fact, it was almost like they hadn't lost touch at all. I can't believe you're back in town, Leah said, glancing up from her cup of tea. Last I heard, you were working out of the city. Jaden nodded, running a hand through his dark hair, a small grin playing at the corners of his mouth. I was. But things changed when Mia came along. I couldn't keep up with the city pace and be the kind of dad she needs. So, here I am. Back to the quiet life. Leah hadn't expected to hear that Jaden was a single father. What happened? She asked carefully, not wanting to pry too much, but curious enough to want to understand. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. Mia's mom and we tried. But it just didn't work out. She's not really in the picture now, so it's just Mia and me. There was no bitterness in his voice, no trace of anger or resentment. It was just a simple fact, and Leah admired how matter-of-fact he was about it. She could sense there was a lot more to the story, but Jaden didn't seem like the type to dwell on the past. That's a big change, Leah said. Moving back here, raising a daughter on your own. I can't imagine how hard that must be. Jaden smiled, his gaze softening. It's not easy, but Mia makes it worth it. She's a good kid. Stubborn as hell, but I guess she gets that from me. Leah found herself smiling, too, despite everything. There was something about Jaden that made her feel at ease, something that loosened the tension in her chest that had been building for years. Maybe it was his calm demeanor or the way he didn't tiptoe around her situation. He didn't seem uncomfortable with her chair, didn't ask too many questions or offer the usual platitudes. It was refreshing. I'd love to meet her, Leah found herself saying, surprising even herself. She hadn't felt like meeting new people, let alone a child, in such a long time. But there was something about the way Jaden spoke about Mia that made Leah curious. Jaden raised an eyebrow, amused. Careful what you wish for. She'll talk your ear off about her obsession with dinosaurs and rainbows. Leah laughed, shaking her head. I think I can handle it. They spent another hour catching up, swapping stories about their time after high school and filling in the blanks on the years they'd missed. Jaden had moved up in the corporate world, but when Mia came along, everything shifted. He'd realized he didn't want the fast-paced life he'd been chasing, so he came back to give Mia a more stable upbringing. The small town felt safer, simpler, and he liked that. Leah could understand the desire for stability. Her own life had been nothing but chaos since the accident. Eventually, Jaden glanced at his watch. I should probably get going. Mia's with my parents right now, but if I stay gone too long, she'll think I abandoned her. Leah nodded, feeling a pang of regret that their time together was ending so soon. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed real conversation, the kind that wasn't clouded by pity or awkwardness. Jaden had brought that back, even if only for a short while. "I'm glad we ran into each other," Leah said, and she meant it. "It's nice to see an old friend." Jaden smiled, standing and pushing his chair back. "We should do this again sometime. You could come by and meet Mia. She'd love to show off her dinosaur collection." Leah felt her heart tug in a way she hadn't expected. "I'd like that," she said softly. Over the next few weeks, Leah found herself spending more time with Jaden and Mia. It started with a casual visit to his place one afternoon, where Mia greeted her at the door with wide eyes and an enthusiasm that made Leah's heart warm in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Mia was everything Jaden had described and more: bright, chatty, and full of endless questions. Leah quickly discovered that Jaden had not been exaggerating about the dinosaurs. Mia knew everything there was to know about them, from the T-Rex to the lesser-known species, and she wasn't shy about sharing her knowledge. Leah felt a strange sense of ease in Jaden's home. He made sure she was comfortable, but not in a way that made her feel like a burden. He was thoughtful without being overbearing, and Mia's constant chatter filled the spaces where awkwardness might have crept in. It was the kind of easy companionship Leah hadn't realized she needed until she found it again. They fell into a routine, one that Leah didn't mind at all. Sometimes she would help Mia with her school projects, or they'd sit around the kitchen table, Jaden cooking while Leah and Mia talked about books and dinosaurs. It was the kind of simple, domestic life Leah had once dreamed of having. Leah sat in her usual spot at the small wooden desk in her bedroom, staring at the email on her laptop screen. It was a simple message, only a few lines long, but it might as well have been a beacon flashing in front of her eyes. "Dear Leah, we've read your work and would love to discuss a potential collaboration. We believe your voice would be a great addition to our team of writers." Her breath caught in her throat as she reread the words, trying to let them sink in. They'd found her stories, her small, personal creations that she'd tucked away online without any real expectation that someone would care. But here it was, an offer from a children's magazine, not just to publish one of her stories, but to write for them regularly. It was real. Someone, somewhere, had read her words and thought they mattered. She could hardly believe it. Leah's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to reply immediately, to say yes before the offer slipped through her fingers like so many other things had. But a wave of hesitation held her back. Was she really ready for this? Could she handle the pressure of deadlines, of writing for an audience, of putting herself out there in a way that she hadn't done since her accident? Before she could get too lost in her thoughts, her phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating against the wood. She glanced down and saw Jaden's name flash on the screen. It was as if the universe knew exactly who she needed to talk to at that moment. She picked up, trying to keep the excitement and nerves out of her voice. "Hey. Hey yourself," Jaden said, his voice warm and familiar on the other end. "What's up?" Leah hesitated for a second, then blurted it out. "I got an offer to write for a children's magazine." There was a pause, and then a laugh filled with pure joy. "Leah, that's amazing. I told you, didn't I? I told you your writing was something special." Leah couldn't help but smile, feeling her heart lift. "I don't know if it's special, but they liked it enough to offer me a job. I didn't expect it." "That's because you're too hard on yourself," Jaden said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've got talent, Leah. You've always had it. You just needed someone else to see it, too." She could hear the pride in his voice, and it made her feel seen. Not for her limitations, not for her past, but for what she could do. For what she was capable of. "I'm nervous," she admitted softly. "I don't know if I can really do this." "Of course you can," Jaden said without hesitation. "You've already done the hardest part, putting yourself out there. This is just the next step. And I know you're going to be incredible." Leah leaned back in her chair, the weight of his words settling in. Jaden had a way of making things seem simpler than they were, but maybe that was what she needed. His unwavering support, the confidence he had in her, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. She let out a breath, her shoulders relaxing just a bit. "I think I'm going to say yes." "You should," Jaden replied, his voice filled with certainty. "And when you do, we're going out to celebrate." "You can't hide from the world forever, Leah." A small laugh escaped her, the tension melting away. All right. But just so you know, you're buying." "Deal," Jaden said, and she could almost hear the smile in his voice. "I'll be the proud guy at the table, bragging about how I know a famous writer." Leah rolled her eyes, but warmth bloomed in her chest. "I'm hardly famous, Jaden." "Not yet," he teased. "But soon." Leah pressed send on her response later that evening, her heart still fluttering in her chest. The email was brief, professional, but it said what it needed to. She was in. She was going to take the job. The next few days were a whirlwind. The magazine editor got in touch quickly, outlining the details of the contract and the deadlines she would need to meet. They wanted her to start small, with a few stories for their next issue, and then see where things went from there. It was more than Leah had hoped for, more than she'd ever thought possible after everything. And yet, even as her spirits lifted, as she dove into the work with a renewed sense of purpose, there was a part of her that remained guarded. Her feelings for Jaden, so quietly nestled in the corners of her heart, were growing harder to ignore. He was always there, whether it was a text to check in or an impromptu visit with Mia in tow, his presence was becoming more and more constant in her life. He made her feel normal. Like she wasn't defined by the chair she sat in or the life she used to have. He made her laugh, made her feel seen, and every time he left, there was a tiny part of her that wished he wouldn't. But Leah kept those feelings at bay, pushing them down as far as she could. She didn't know how to navigate them. It wasn't just fear, it was the uncertainty of her own future. What did she really have to offer? A part of her was still healing, still figuring out who she was after the accident, after everything had been stripped away. She wasn't ready to open that door. Not yet. The invitation arrived in her inbox one chilly afternoon, tucked between promotional emails and online shopping receipts. Leah almost missed it, skimming past the subject line, alumni event, celebrating past and present. Her initial reaction was to delete it, as she had with every other attempt her old high school had made to draw her back into the fold of reunions and community events. But something stopped her this time. Maybe it was the email's mention of honoring alumni who had made an impact through their creative work. Maybe it was the slight tug of curiosity, the part of her that wondered what it would be like to step back into that world, the place where her life had so drastically split into before and after. She stared at the screen for a long minute, fingers hovering over the delete button, before deciding, for reasons she couldn't fully explain, to open it. The event was a week away, held in the school's auditorium, a gathering of alumni and current students to bridge the past and the present. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a showcase of talent, of stories and lives that had unfolded after graduation. And apparently, they wanted Leah to be one of the featured guests. Leah leaned back in her chair, unsure how to feel. Part of her wanted to run from it, to avoid facing the inevitable onslaught of familiar faces and whispered questions. But another part of her, a stronger part, was tired of hiding. She had come so far in the last few months, found a new sense of purpose in her writing, a new circle of support with Jaden and Mia. Maybe it was time to face the ghosts of her past head-on. She typed out a simple reply, "I'll be there." The night of the event, Leah found herself in the school's parking lot, staring up at the building she hadn't seen in over a decade. It felt strange, being back here, the memories swirling around her like an old movie reel, slightly faded but still vivid in their own way. The hallways where she'd once walked freely, the auditorium where she had danced in school plays, all of it now seemed distant and foreign. Jaden had offered to come with her, but Leah had insisted on doing this alone. It was something she needed to face without a safety net. She hadn't told him how much it unnerved her, how the idea of seeing people who had known her before the accident made her stomach twist. She hadn't wanted him to see her that vulnerable, not when she'd spent so much time building herself back up. Taking a deep breath, Leah rolled herself toward the entrance, the soft hum of chatter filtering out into the cool night air. The school hadn't changed much, the familiar banners hung in the foyer, the smell of popcorn from the student concession stand wafted through the hall. It was like stepping into a time capsule, except now, she was a different person. She entered the auditorium, her heart beating just a little faster. The room was already filling up, rows of seats occupied by parents, teachers, and alumni. Leah scanned the crowd, her gaze catching glimpses of people she recognized. There, by the snack table, was Allison Turner, who had been captain of the cheerleading squad, now laughing with her husband and kids. Across the room, Brian Adams, who had played football, was talking to one of the teachers. And then, almost predictably, she saw him. Ethan stood near the back of the room, his arm slung casually around his wife's shoulder, his 4 kids clustered around him, laughing at something. Leah's chest tightened for a moment, but she quickly pushed it down. Seeing him now, like this, wasn't as devastating as she'd imagined it would be. There was a time when the sight of him would have been enough to send her spiraling, but now, she just felt detached. A distant chapter from a story she no longer needed to revisit. She rolled herself toward the side of the room, avoiding direct eye contact with anyone for the moment. She wasn't ready for casual greetings or awkward conversations. Not yet. Instead, she focused on calming the nerves fluttering in her stomach as she waited for the program to begin. The event kicked off with the school principal making an opening speech, welcoming everyone and talking about the importance of community and how proud they were of their alumni. Leah half listened, her thoughts drifting, until she heard her name. And tonight, we have a special guest, Leah Mitchell, an alum who has recently made waves with her incredible work in children's literature. We're so honored to have her here to share her story. Leah's breath caught. She hadn't been prepared for the spotlight to hit her quite so suddenly. But as the audience's applause began to fill the room, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even anxiety. It was a quiet confidence, a recognition of the journey she had taken to get to this point. The principal gestured toward her, and Leah wheeled herself to the front of the room, feeling all the eyes on her. For a brief moment, the world felt too small, too focused on her, but then she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had prepared a brief reading from one of her stories, but more than that, she wanted to speak. To let them know how far she had come, not just as a writer, but as a person. "Hi, everyone," Leah began, her voice steady but soft. "I never imagined I'd be standing here, or sitting here, rather, speaking to you all tonight. It's been a long road since I left these halls, and like many of you, I've faced my share of challenges. But those challenges have shaped me in ways I couldn't have predicted." She paused, glancing out at the crowd. Ethan was still there, watching, but so were dozens of other faces she didn't know. Parents of students, teachers who had no idea who she was. And that was okay. I started writing because it was the only way I could make sense of the world after everything changed. It became my way of processing, of creating something out of the chaos. And now, I get to share those stories with kids who see the world with wide open eyes, who believe in magic and wonder. That's something I never thought I'd have again, wonder. The room was quiet, attentive, and Leah felt a sense of peace settle over her. She read the excerpt from her story with confidence, her voice clear, and when she finished, the applause was genuine and warm. For the first time in a long time, Leah felt like she belonged, not just in the world of her past, but in the life she had now. As she wheeled herself back to her seat, a small smile played on her lips. She had faced the past and come out stronger. Leah's days were starting to fill with more than just her writing. The small sense of purpose that had begun with her first published story was now blooming into something larger, something she hadn't dared to hope for. Her work with the children's magazine was growing, more stories, more opportunities to connect with readers who sent in letters and drawings inspired by her tales. She could see the ripple effect her words were having, and it fueled her in ways she couldn't quite explain. But it wasn't just her professional life that was changing. There was Jaden. He had become a steady presence in her world, someone she could count on without question. Whether it was showing up with coffee on a long writing day or inviting her over to spend time with him and Mia, Jaden had woven himself into her routine in a way that felt seamless. And while Leah had tried to keep her emotions at bay, she could no longer deny what was happening between them. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, in the warmth of his smile when she made him laugh, and in the quiet moments where they didn't need to say anything at all. The connection between them had grown, but with it came a mix of emotions Leah wasn't sure she was ready to unpack. They were sitting on the porch at Jaden's house one evening, the late spring air cool and gentle. Mia had gone to bed, and the sky above them was a deep navy, stars just beginning to peek through the darkness. Jaden leaned back in his chair, glancing over at Leah. "You've been quiet tonight," he said softly, breaking the silence that had settled over them. "Everything okay?" Leah hesitated, unsure how to put her swirling thoughts into words. She didn't want to ruin the ease they'd found with each other, didn't want to push too hard or too fast, but the feelings were there, growing, persistent, impossible to ignore. "I'm fine," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "Just thinking." Jaden's brow furrowed slightly, but his gaze remained soft. "Thinking about what?" Leah looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup. "About this. Us. You and Mia. How good it all feels, but also how complicated it could get." Jaden didn't say anything at first, just let her words settle between them. Then he reached out, placing his hand gently over hers. "Leah," he said, his voice low and steady. "It doesn't have to be complicated. Not if we don't make it that way." Her heart tugged at the simplicity of his words. Of course, he would say that. He was always so sure, so confident in his feelings. But Leah wasn't used to certainty. She had spent so long building walls around herself, keeping her emotions locked away where they couldn't hurt her. Letting Jaden in meant tearing those walls down, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to do that. "I don't want to mess this up," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hurt you or Mia." Jaden's grip on her hand tightened just slightly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a slow, comforting rhythm. "You won't," he said simply. "And even if things get messy, we'll figure it out. Together." Leah's chest tightened at his words. He made it sound so easy, but she knew better. Nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. Still, there was a part of her that wanted to believe him, that wanted to take the leap and see where it could go. "I'm scared," she confessed, the vulnerability of the words surprising even herself. Jaden's gaze softened even more, and he leaned forward, his face just inches from hers. "So am I," he said quietly. "But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the air between them thick with the weight of unspoken possibilities. And then, slowly, Leah nodded. "Okay," she whispered. Jaden smiled, a slow, warm smile that made her heart skip a beat, and for the first time in a long time, Leah let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to be as complicated as she feared. At the same time, another relationship in Leah's life was shifting. Her mother had been calling more often, and for once, Leah wasn't avoiding the conversations. They still had their moments of tension, but the constant friction that had once defined their relationship seemed to be easing. One afternoon, her mother showed up at her door, holding a plate of cookies as if it were a peace offering. Leah opened the door, surprised to see her standing there. "I thought I'd stop by," her mother said, her voice tentative, as though she wasn't sure if she would be welcomed. Leah stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said softly. Her mother shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I wanted to. And besides, it's been a while since we spent any real time together." Leah didn't disagree. It had been a long time since they'd had a proper visit that didn't end in raised voices or tense silences. They sat together in the living room, sipping tea and picking at the cookies, and for the first time in years, the conversation felt normal. "I'm really proud of you, you know," her mother said after a while, her voice quiet but sincere. "The writing, the way you've handled everything." I know I haven't always said it, but I am. Leah blinked, surprised by the admission. Her mother wasn't one for emotional confessions, and hearing those words now, after all the years of tension, struck something deep inside her. Thanks, Leah said softly, her throat tight. That means a lot. They sat in a comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea. Leah could feel the weight of the past between them, but for the first time, it didn't feel insurmountable. They were making progress, slowly, but surely. You know, her mother said, her voice a little lighter now, I was thinking, maybe we could go to the park sometime. Get some fresh air. You and me. Leah smiled, her heart lifting at the simple suggestion. I'd like that. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, and Leah knew there were still things left unsaid between them. But this was a start, a step toward healing the wounds that had festered for far too long. Leah sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Outside, the late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. Jaden sat across from her, leaning forward, his eyes full of warmth and quiet determination. He had just suggested something Leah hadn't seriously considered in years, giving physical therapy another try. She didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing, her thoughts tangled with old memories of disappointment, frustration, and pain. The idea of going back to that, of putting her body through those endless exercises that had once felt like torture, was almost too much to bear. She had tried therapy before, and it hadn't worked. Why would it be any different now? I don't know, Jaden, Leah said finally, her voice soft but edged with doubt. It's been years. What's the point? Jaden leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. The point is that you deserve a chance. Maybe things won't change, but maybe they will. You won't know unless you try. She wanted to argue, to tell him he didn't understand. But the truth was, Jaden wasn't pushing her out of pity or some misplaced sense of obligation. He believed in her, and that belief had become something Leah wasn't sure she could ignore. I've tried so many times, she murmured, her fingers tracing the edge of the mug. And nothing worked. I don't know if I can handle the disappointment again. Jaden's eyes softened. I get that. I do. But this time, you're not doing it alone. I'll be with you every step of the way. Leah looked up, meeting his gaze. There was something so calm, so sure in the way he said it. It wasn't just words, he meant it. Jaden had a way of cutting through her fears, of making her believe that things didn't have to be as impossible as they seemed. A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was contemplative, heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. Leah could feel the hesitation clawing at her, the part of her that wanted to retreat, to avoid another potential failure. But then there was the other part of her, the part that had been growing stronger ever since Jaden came into her life. The part that wanted to hope again. Finally, she exhaled, nodding slightly. Okay. I'll try. Jaden's smile was slow but genuine. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. That's all I'm asking. The first few therapy sessions were grueling, just as Leah had remembered. The exercises were familiar, the sterile smell of the physical therapy room triggering memories of past frustration and pain. Her body felt heavy, her muscles tight and resistant to every movement. The therapists were kind, but Leah could sense the same quiet uncertainty in their eyes that she had seen before. Jaden was there, just as he promised. He stood by her side during the sessions, offering encouragement without overstepping. He wasn't pushy, didn't try to sugarcoat the struggle she was facing. But he was steady, a presence that Leah found herself leaning on more than she had expected. After a week of sessions, Leah's frustration began to build. She still couldn't feel any real progress, and every exercise felt like an uphill battle with no end in sight. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session, Leah wheeled herself out of the therapy room and stopped in the hallway, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I don't know if I can do this, she said, her voice sharp with frustration. I feel like I'm putting myself through hell for nothing. Jaden knelt beside her, his expression calm but serious. Leah, I know it's hard. I know it doesn't feel like it's getting any easier. But you've made it this far. Don't quit now. Leah clenched her fists in her lap, anger and exhaustion mixing inside her like a toxic brew. But what if I never see progress, Jaden? What if this is all pointless? He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. It's not pointless. Every step, every session, whether you see it or not, is moving you forward. You've already come further than you realize. Leah wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that this time would be different, that her body hadn't given up on her entirely. But the doubt was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, whispering that she was setting herself up for disappointment. But even in her frustration, she couldn't ignore the steady presence of Jaden. His belief in her hadn't wavered, and that, more than anything, was enough to keep her going. Several more weeks passed, and the therapy sessions continued. Leah's frustration ebbed and flowed, but Jaden remained her constant, never letting her fall too far into doubt. Then, one morning during a routine session, something changed. Leah was working through a set of leg stretches, the therapist gently guiding her movements, when she felt it. A small flicker, barely there, but real. It was faint, a tingling sensation in her right leg, just at the edge of her awareness. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it, but as the therapist adjusted her position, the sensation grew stronger. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening as she looked down at her legs. I felt something, she whispered, her voice shaky. The therapist paused, looking at her with cautious optimism. Are you sure? Leah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Yes. I'm sure. The room seemed to go still as the realization sunk in. It wasn't much, just a small flicker of sensation, but it was more than Leah had felt in years. It was something. And in that moment, it felt like everything. When the session ended, Leah could barely contain her emotions. As she wheeled herself out of the room, Jaden was waiting for her in the hallway, as always. But this time, when she saw him, tears sprang to her eyes, tears she hadn't realized were there. I felt something, she said, her voice breaking. In my leg. Jaden's expression softened, a slow smile spreading across his face. Leah, that's incredible. She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. It's not much, but it's something. I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. Jaden stepped forward, cupping her face gently in his hands. You're stronger than you know, he said softly. You've always been. Leah's heart swelled at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to fully feel it, the connection between them, the quiet love that had been growing all along. She looked into Jaden's eyes, her walls finally beginning to crumble, and leaned into him. This time, she wasn't afraid. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Leah's new home, the home she now shared with Jaden and Mia. It was a small house, cozy but full of light, with a garden that Mia had already claimed as her own. The space was perfect, not too big, not too small, and it felt like the kind of place where a new chapter could begin. Leah sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee as she watched Jaden move around the kitchen, his movements familiar and comforting. There was something different in the air, a sense of peace Leah hadn't felt in a long time. Life had changed so much over the past few months, her writing career was taking off, her therapy was making real progress, and most of all, she was no longer alone. Jaden had become her partner in every sense of the word. They were a team, supporting each other through every high and low, and for the first time, Leah felt like she had found something real, something lasting. She smiled to herself as Mia came bounding into the kitchen, her blonde hair a mess from sleep, but her face bright with excitement. Leah! Can we work in the garden today? Mia asked, practically bouncing in place. I want to plant the flowers you bought. Leah laughed, setting her mud down. I think that sounds like a great idea. Let's get started after breakfast. Jaden shot her a smile from across the kitchen, one that made her heart skip in the way it always did. You're going to turn her into a master gardener, you know that, right? Leah grinned. It's not a bad skill to have. And besides, we need more flowers in that garden. It was small moments like these that made Leah realize how much her life had shifted. She had once thought her future would be filled with quiet loneliness, just her and her writing, but now there was Mia, Jaden, and the simple joy of sharing a life together. There was laughter in her house, warmth in her days, and a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Leah's writing career had blossomed in ways she hadn't anticipated. The children's magazine she wrote for had given her a steady stream of assignments, and she was now working on a book, a collection of fairy tales inspired by her own experiences. Writing had always been her outlet, her way of making sense of the world, but now it had become more than just a personal escape. It was her connection to something larger. She had received letters from children, parents, and teachers who had read her stories and found hope in them. They wrote to tell her how her characters had inspired them, how her words had made them believe in magic again. It was humbling and exhilarating all at once, and it made every late night, every difficult draft, worth it. But it wasn't just the success that fueled her, it was the opportunity to give back. Leah had been invited to join a local support group for disabled children. The group met once a week at the community center, and when she was asked to come and read her stories to the kids, she had hesitated at first. The thought of standing, or rather, sitting, in front of a room full of children who might look at her wheelchair and only see what she couldn't do scared her. But she realized that if she could give them even a fraction of the hope she'd found, it would be worth it. Her first day at the support group had been nerve-wracking, but the moment she wheeled into the room and saw the children's eager faces, all her fears melted away. There was something magical about connecting with them, about sharing her stories, and watching their eyes light up with wonder. She started coming every week, reading new stories and sharing parts of her own journey. The children were curious, asking questions about her wheelchair, about her writing, about the characters in her stories. Leah answered them all, honest but gentle, showing them that even though life had changed for her, it hadn't ended. One afternoon, after reading a story about a girl who discovers she has the power to heal others with her touch, one of the children, a girl named Lily, raised her hand. "Leah, do you think you'll ever walk again?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with innocence. Leah paused, considering her answer. She had spent so much time thinking about that question herself, wondering if her legs would ever truly work again. But now, she had a different perspective. "Maybe," Leah said, her voice steady. "But whether I walk or not, I know I can still do amazing things." "And so can you. It's not about what we can't do, it's about what we can." Lily smiled, her face lighting up with understanding, and Leah felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was what mattered, showing these children that their futures weren't defined by their limitations. They had the power to create their own stories, just like she had. Life had a way of surprising Leah. There were days when she would sit in her office, working on a new story, and find herself reflecting on how much had changed. The woman she had been a year ago would never have imagined this, living with Jaden and Mia, building a life that felt whole and full. Her heart was lighter, her days filled with purpose, and the future no longer seemed like something to fear. One evening, after a particularly long day of writing and volunteering, Leah sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Jaden joined her, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and sat down beside her. They didn't need to speak, there was a comfortable silence between them, a shared understanding that words weren't always necessary. Leah glanced over at him, feeling that familiar tug in her chest. "I never thought I'd have this," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the evening breeze. Jaden looked at her, his eyes soft and full of love. "Neither did I. But I'm glad we found it." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Me too."